In the misty dawn of the 16th day of the month of frost, when Monteluna's sky was still a pale veil, and the monastery bells tolled gravely, as if announcing not a new day, but an approaching destiny, Naila awoke without having slept. She slept among bundles of damp straw in the salt shed, south of the castle, where winds hissed like ancient laments through the stone crevices. She had been a palace slave for 7 winters, acquired by a northern merchant and sold like a useful object. Nameless, storyless, merely for her strong shoulders and eyes that didn't waver. Her presence was as discreet as a whisper in the middle of a sermon, yet she carried a dignity that chains could not crush. They said she came from the Sunset Mountains, where women learned to weave silence with resilience. The kingdom of Monteluna at that time was a cracked jewel. Palaces of white marble and gleaming gold hid shadowy corridors where cruelty disguised itself with perfumes and titles. At its center, young King Gale, crowned at 18 after his father's sudden collapse, a cruel and superstitious monarch, governed with the weight of tradition on his shoulders and the dull gaze of one who had inherited more walls than bridges. Surrounded by black-robed counselors and lords with rings too heavy for their fingers, Gale was considered just, but cold. He obeyed ancestral laws, feared the clergy, distrusted the people. He had never loved, never been loved, except by his golden falcon and the ancient portraits of a mother he never knew. But on that day, as he rode to inspect the stables after the storm, he saw something that would forever alter the course of history. A woman covered in mud, standing in the rain, not lowering her gaze before any king. The ground was waterlogged, and the horses stepped reluctantly in the thick mud that reached the knees of those figures bent under the weight of the wagons. Naila, however, did not move. She stood motionless before the cracked gate of the warehouse, her torn hood dripping water down her back, her hands still dirty with ash, holding a rope that tethered an old, blind donkey. When the guards ordered her to get out of the way, she didn't speak, didn't hesitate. She simply looked at them as one observes a stone in the middle of a river, without fear, without pleading. It was then that the king saw her, not as a lord sees his servant, but as if he saw a premonition. And there, amidst distant thunder and the damp smell of turned earth, something shifted within him, a subtle discomfort, like a loose thread in an old fabric. Gale dismounted without thinking. The soldiers recoiled, confused. The king crossed the muddy courtyard with slow steps, while Naila watched him with aged copper eyes, eyes that didn't blink, didn't waver, but also didn't implore. There was something about this woman that contradicted the world. She was small, frail, with skin marked by thin scars like ant trails, yet she held her chin high as if carrying an invisible crown. He stopped 2 paces from her and said nothing. It wasn't necessary. Both heard what no one else heard, the silence that occurs when 2 stories, until then separate, recognize each other. The rain ceased at that instant, as if the sky itself leaned in to listen to what was being born there, not love yet, but a crack in the wall of time. For the rest of that day, Gale couldn't forget the woman's eyes. He returned to the palace with his cloak still wet, ignoring the whispers of the servants and the disapproving glances of the council elders. He sat before the black marble fireplace in his chambers and, for the first time in years, allowed silence to fill him entirely. Naila's face, molded in mud and dignity, appeared before him like a memory of something he had never lived, yet which felt familiar, perhaps an echo of the freedom denied to him, since he learned to walk with his head held high only as far as tradition allowed. That night, the king did not summon musicians, did not read decrees, did not visit the hanging gardens where nobles usually displayed their wives like stained glass. He only listened to the crackling of the embers and his own heart, beating like a war drum. On the other side of the castle, Naila had returned to her post unpunished, which for a slave was almost a miracle. No word had passed between her and the king, but the royal guard's eyes followed her with double attention from that moment on. The other slaves whispered, laughed softly, some with envy, others with fear. But Naila remained as silent as the stone that knows what it supports, even if no one notices. At night, wrapped in rags beside the cold oven in the old kitchen, she didn't think of the king, but of something more dangerous, what it meant to be seen, not as a servant, nor as a tool, but as a presence. That was new, and everything new in Monteluna either becomes legend or is crushed. In the days that followed, Gale began to wander through previously ignored sections of the castle. Under the pretext of inspections, he visited the granary before dawn, the stable before dinner, the lower kitchen where cauldrons simmered with bones and rage. And there, in some damp corner or uncarpeted corridor, he would find Naila, or just her shadow, her absence, her trace of silence. They didn't speak. Sometimes they just looked at each other. Other times he pretended to look for something among the sacks of grain, and she pretended not to see him. But that single instant when their gazes met was enough for everything around them, the creaking of wagons, the clinking of chains, the murmuring of priests, to fade like a candle in the wind. It was a love that grew like the roots of a forbidden tree, subterranean, invisible but impossible to uproot without shaking the earth. The court, with its keen nose for anything that defied order, began to murmur. The Count of Lioren, who wore rings with rubies the size of children's teeth, remarked in the tapestry hall that the king was too distracted by miseries. The Mother Superior of the House of Laments, a woman in stiff linen habits and eyes like wet coal, declared in confession that there is witchcraft when a slave's gaze bends a king's will. The rumors spilled like wine down golden corridors, and where there was silence, poison found an echo. What might have been mere curiosity became a threat. Because in Monteluna, love was tolerated only when sealed by noble blood or by war pacts. And Naila, with her skin tanned by the southern sun and her soul that would not bend, was a living heresy. The first touch happened by chance, or so it would seem to any inattentive observer. Naila was carrying a pitcher of water, and as she crossed the inner garden, she tripped on a hidden root beneath the late snow. Gale, who was passing by on a royal whim, held her wrist before she fell. The pitcher broke, spilling water on the atrium steps, but neither of them moved. The touch was brief, yet filled with a forbidden warmth. Naila's fingers trembled, but not from fear. And Gale, who could order walls to be built with a gesture, knew at that instant that he would never be able to raise any barrier against what was being born between them. He said nothing, merely picked up a fragment of the broken pitcher and handed it to her as one seals a pact. And he left. From that day on, Gale stopped hiding. He began to summon Naila for symbolic tasks, serving him during banquets, though she said nothing, nor raised her eyes before the dukes. He would send for her to translate ancient southern inscriptions, even though there were monks for that. And when she brought him diseased herbs or reports of plagues in the villages, he listened with an attention he didn't even give his generals. Gradually, an uncomfortable presence settled on the throne, not officially, but like the smell of an approaching storm. When, on an eclipse afternoon, Gale appeared with a necklace of red beads and discreetly placed it around Naila's neck in plain sight of everyone, the hall froze. There was no kiss, no announcement, but in that silence full of symbols, the scandal became unavoidable. The nobility trembled, the clergy armed themselves with sharp prayers, and the people began to hear, for the first time in centuries, the name of a slave woman whispered as hope. The ceremony was set for the second day of the last harvest month, when the fields still burned. Golden and the gods, according to the priests, were more attentive to the decisions of men. Nobles from all provinces were summoned. Generals arrived bedecked. Priests lined up in their purple tunics. No one knew the reason for the event, but all felt that something out of the usual rhythm was approaching. In the great hall of spiraling columns, where even echoes seemed to weigh their words, Gale appeared in simple clothes, without crown or scepter. Beside him, Naila walked in a dress embroidered by humble southern hands, barefoot, her hair braided with copper threads. A shock ran through the hall like a blade dragged over stone, when the king raised his hand and said, in a firm voice, "This is the woman I have chosen to reign by my side." The world seemed to break into silence. The chaos came not from shouts, but from suppressed sighs, burning glances, and poisonous murmurs that echoed in cloisters and dormitories for weeks. The Archbishop of Aris declared that the heavens would weep. The Duchess of Bralhar wrote urgent letters to neighboring kingdoms, warning that Monteluna had gone mad. But above all, the people were divided. Many, in the forgotten villages, saw in Naila the chance for a new era, a woman of the earth like them, elevated not by gold or pact, but by choice and courage. Others, poisoned by centuries of tradition, could not conceive of a queen without royal blood. They painted walls with insults, burned banners with her name. And, on that same night, Naila crossed the palace threshold as future queen. A dagger was left under her pillow, silent, cold, and far more eloquent than any spoken threat. Naila's coronation was swift, without fanfare or crowds. The throne, carved from ebony with the history of past kings, seemed to find its new weight strange. The queen's eyes, however, did not seek approval. She walked among tapestries as one crosses a minefield, knowing that every gesture would be judged, every silence interpreted as arrogance or ignorance. The court ladies offered her smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The stewards delivered false reports, hoping to see her stumble on the First Order. Even the cathedral bells rang out of tune that day, as if refusing to celebrate. But Naila, like the southern mountains that resist the wind for millennia, stood firm. She responded calmly, studied at night, listened to advice only from those who knew hunger. She was queen, yes, but carried on her shoulders the weight of being a stranger. On her own throne, when Gale was called to negotiate with the kingdom of Lesthia, he left reluctantly, leaving Naila as regent. The nobles smiled with disguised satisfaction. No sooner had the king's carriage disappeared through the north gates than destabilizing moves began. The wines served to Naila became strangely too sweet. The new maids came from the convent of the Sisters of Silence, known for housing clergy spies. Documents disappeared, and rumors spread through the corridors that she practiced witchcraft, used the blood of southern children, and conjured ancestral spirits to dominate the king. One day, upon opening an old book from the library, she found between the pages a dried petal with words written in red ink, "Queen of the End." Naila did not tremble, but she noted the faces. She knew that there, in the castle of the nobles, daggers were more effective when they cut not flesh, but reputation. The South received her with wet eyes and calloused hands. Naila arrived on foot, her feet wounded and her face covered with the dust of forgotten roads, but she didn't need to say a single word. The women came first, bringing raw linen cloaks and fresh bread. Then came the men, silent as the mountains, raising small offerings, roots, tools, baskets of grain. Naila slept for the first time in weeks under a simple wooden roof, surrounded by children who did not fear her skin nor her history. And when the elder Ibram, blind in one eye and guardian of ancient songs, placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "A queen without a throne is still a queen to those who have no ground," something in her broke, not in pain, but in revelation. The crown, which had always weighed on her like iron, began to take the form of a flame. It was in this forgotten refuge that news arrived that the capital tried to hide. The nobles, desperate to maintain their privileges, had secretly negotiated with Lesthia's envoys, offering access to the southern borders in exchange for promises of titles and protection. Monteluna was not just weakened, it was on the verge of being devoured from within. When Naila read the names of the traitors, many of the same who had whispered advice to her on the throne. She did not cry. She only asked for a blanket and rode to the highest slope of the mountains. There, standing on the black stones, with the wind tearing at her clothes and her eyes burning with rage, she swore aloud, "I will not fight for palaces. I will fight for those who were never invited into them." The mountains heard, and that night, for the first time in centuries, the ancient war drum sounded in the south. At first it wasn't an army, it was a breath, a wisp of smoke spreading among the fields and villages. Naila knew that battles were won not just with swords, but with well-told stories. She sent veiled messengers, midwives who carried herbs and also hope. In each village they told what had happened, not with shouts, but with steady eyes and low voices. They spoke of the woman expelled without crime, of the absent king, of the nobles who sold the walls for foreign medals. And little by little, those who had been forgotten began to arrive. Widows with strong hands, blacksmiths with coal eyes, youths with burning chests. They wore no uniforms, but carried the same will to prevent Monteluna from becoming just a name on the enemy's maps. At the foot of the mountains, they built a camp where tents were made of donated fabrics and shields forged from old ironwork. Naila trained them at dawn, with firm movements and few words. They taught each other, a farmer who could aim accurately, a former acolyte who had memorized the cathedral maps, an old hunter who spoke with owls. The invisibility of the south became an advantage. They moved through the forests without leaving a trace, cut off invader supplies unseen. Naila led not as queen, but as a sister. She shared bread, cleaned wounds, mended rags as she once mended silences. And when she sat by the fire, eyes on the sky, the others fell silent, not out of fear, but because everyone wanted to hear what the future sounded like on the lips of one who had already lost everything and yet still stood. Naila's fame crossed the fields, like fire spreading through dry leaves before summer. In just one moon, her deeds became legend in taverns and sacristies. They spoke of the woman who had survived the noble's poison, faced the clergy's fury, and been reborn among those who had nothing. Children drew her face on stones with charcoal, and mothers invoked her in prayers as they cooked porridge. Even in the capital, among the palace maids and scribe apprentices, her name began to be whispered with reverence. The one who returned from exile, the one who sees in the dark. Those who feared her began to call her Shadow, as if she were a premonition. But those who hoped for justice called her Flame, because wherever she passed, something within people ignited. It wasn't long before the king's own troops, abandoned by corrupt generals, began to desert in silence, guided by the roots of the resistance. The maps of the south were redrawn with smoke trails and signs on trees. There were signs on doors, 3 parallel scratches that meant safe haven. Naila asked not for loyalty, only truth. When a young soldier knelt before her, offering his sword, she refused it with a phrase that would be repeated in centuries to come. "Kneel before the people, not me." The old bards began to compose verses that didn't rhyme with kings or saints, but with roots, seeds, and courage. The revolt was not visible to the court's eyes, but it had already begun. And it moved like the tides beneath the surface, inevitable, silent, and ancestral. On the 17th day of the late harvest, the southern watchtowers lit high bonfires, an ancient sign of imminent danger. Lestia's army marched like a river of iron and scarlet, crossing the borders with golden standards and war drums. Spears gleamed in the sun, and horses wore black armor like an eclipse night. The traitorous nobles had promised an easy kingdom, already surrendered, but they found empty valleys and silent villages, as if the people had evaporated. When the enemy general reached the foot of the southernmost hill, he saw only seemingly deserted fields and a mist rising from the burned crops. He laughed. They fled. But he little knew that every stone on the path had been marked, every bush hid watchful eyes, and every step led them into the trap woven by invisible hands. The next morning, Before the sun broke through the mists, the mountain bells chimed. Naila emerged from the dawn vapors in a dark red cloak that floated like blood in the wind. Her presence silenced even the birds. There was no crown on her head, but her eyes carried centuries of struggle. Beside her, peasants armed with scythes, spears made of fire-hardened wood, and even boiling iron pots. It was not an army, as chroniclers were. Accustomed to record, it was an entire people standing, as if the earth had decided to rise against those who trampled it. The first attack came from above. Stones rolled down the slopes, bringing down horses. Then short arrows, fired with precision between tree trunks and hills. And finally, the frontal advance. The clash between worlds was brutal, but not unbalanced. The children of the South fought not for glory, but for existence. The general of Lesthia, a tall and cruel man with scars, crossing his face like ancient lightning, advanced with his personal guard amidst the carnage. He sought Naila with thirsty eyes, certain that a woman would not resist the steel of a northern war veteran. When he found her, she was unarmed, kneeling beside a wounded boy, stemming the blood with her bare hands. "Get up, slave!" he roared, raising his sword. Naila stood. There was no fear in her posture, only weariness and resolve. Someone threw her a short spear. She caught it with a naturalness that seemed from another time. The duel lasted 7 eternal minutes. With each blow she retreated, dodged, and counterattacked with brutal precision. Those watching forgot to breathe. And then, with a spin that defied the weight of pain and history, Naila plunged the blade into the general's flank. When he fell, the field seemed to stop. A heavy silence covered the valleys, as if even the gods awaited the next gesture. Naila, sweaty and wounded, did not celebrate. She merely closed her eyes and let herself fall to her knees. There was no victory on her lips, only relief. Behind her, Monteluna's banners were raised by hands of clay and callous. The enemy, stunned, retreated in disarray. The people advanced. For the first time in centuries, the southern land was defended by its own children, and it won. The drums ceased, the owls began to sing, and the winds carried her name through the mountains as one blows embers to rekindle the world. They brought Naila back to the capital not in a golden litter, but in an ox cart covered with blankets woven by the village women. The city bells rang on their own. They say the winds pushed them. As she approached the gates of Monteluna, crowds knelt in the dust, not out of imposition, but out of gratitude. The nobles fell silent, dressed in their disguised mourning clothes. The clergy offered forced prayers, muffled by songs from the people. At the top of the palace staircase, once so cold and unreachable, Naila ascended with slow steps, her face still marked by the dry blood of battle. When she stopped before the empty throne, she did not sit. She turned to the people and simply said, "It is yours now." The echo of these words swept through the halls like gentle thunder. The next afternoon, under a clear and windy sky, Gale returned. The king's eyes had lost the arrogance of youth and gained wrinkles etched by regret. When he saw her among the courtyard columns, so fragile and so immense, he knelt, not for show, not for politics, but because he knew deep within himself that he had been saved by her. "Do you forgive me?" he whispered, and she, with a touch on his shoulders, replied, "Love exists only where forgiveness flourishes." The kiss between them did not ignite the crowd. It quieted hearts. It was a gesture of reconciliation between worlds. Naila did not become queen again by decree. She was crowned by simple voices, by calloused hands, by children who already knew how to sing her name. And so, with a setting sun as witness, the new era began. In the years that followed, Monteluna did not transform into a paradise, but it became human. The land was divided among those who cultivated it. The palace halls opened into schools. The throne was emptied of luxury and filled with listening. The clergy, facing the undeniable strength of the people, ceded ground to justice. The golden masks were removed from the faces of the nobles, some by force, others by shame, and Naila, though called Mother of the New Kingdom, preferred to walk barefoot among the markets and listen to children's stories in the squares. She never got used to formality. She never let titles erase who she had been. She remained small, watchful, with that gaze that pierced silences and measured the world from within. When she finally departed, old and serene, the kingdom did not weep. It sang. Thousands followed the procession with simple instruments and flowers in their hair. Her body was buried high on the hill where she had faced the general. On the tomb, no statue, no coat of arms, only a stone with the words that Gale, now widowed and transformed, wrote with his own hands. Here rests the woman who taught a king to love. And so, generation after generation, even when books faded or palaces fell, Naila's name remained. In the songs of shepherds, in the prayers of mothers, in stories told by the fire. And in every seed planted with hope, someone still says, she taught us to resist in silence and to win